Romantic science has constantly struggled with the popular conception that, as a discipline, it is antithetical to romantic art. This misconception thrives on the idea that, 1. There is an essential incompatibility between the methodical objective sciences and the subjectivities of art, and 2. That romantic writers in general are anti-science. This presentation will review some of the accusations that paint romantic art and artists as anti-science, as well as introduce some of the ways in which scholars are now beginning to see romantic art and science as sympathetic to each other. The developing view of humans as natural objects rather than anthropocentric subjects in the early 19th century challenged some romantic writers to reconceptualize their relations to nature, particularly in the face of Cartesianism. Cartesianism is the philosophy that came to be associated throughout the 18th and 19th century with dehumanizing and demystifying science, everything art reputedly defied at the time. Cartesianism appeared in a broad sweep to strip humankind of its soul and centrality to the universe. It was through a series of works, including Discourse on the Method, Meditations on First Philosophy, and Treatise on Man, that René Descartes claimed that the human consists of two separable ingredients, a soul and a body. In particular, he is best known for the idea that the body is just a machine, and though Descartes himself drew a line of distinction between animals and humans, saying animals lacked the thinking, conscious soul which humans had, this argument introduced the suggestion that the human body without a soul is just like the animal body. From here, later empiricists such as John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume escalated Descartes' reasoning, following it to its logical conclusion and announcing that the whole human, mind and body, is mechanistic, that all we know comes from experience and reflection upon the experiences of our bodies. Thus came suggestions that the human is not human at all, but rather entirely machine, meaning little could differentiate a person not just from animals, but from inanimate objects such as grass, rocks, and water. The final jolt came when Julien Lefebvre de la Mettrie debuted his Man-a-Machine, which not only explicitly challenged Descartes' claims that animals are unthinking brutes, but denied the existence of an immaterial soul. This last argument, a materialist claim that the soul and all thought processes, including reason, imagination, and emotion, were just byproducts of material systems in the body, threatened to erase the last shred of what was once traditionally understood as a distinction for humankind. By the 19th century, it is understandable then that for some, science appeared to be a serious and threatening force of dehumanization. Indeed, it is this onset of materialistic philosophy that appears to have begun the rift between science and art, or as others might say, matter and meaning. It is this history that helped give rise to a myth of anti-science romanticism. We may argue now in retrospect that the tensions between the sciences and arts had many influencing factors, including century-long developments in philosophy, industrialization, urbanization, and education. However, it is only recently that scholars are beginning to seriously consider and accept the interconnections these querulous disciplines have had throughout history. It used to be a commonly accepted idea that not only did the rift between the sciences and arts begin with the Romantic era, but that the rift was due to a deep and irreversible incompatibility between the two. In some ways, this misconception is understandable. Romanticism is usually defined as an artistic and intellectual movement in the Western world that puts great emphasis upon individual experience and emotions. This may seem confusing to us because it sounds a lot like romanticists should be aligned with the empirical thoughts of those like John Locke. However, the difference at the time was that whereas the sciences of the late 18th century valued the rationalization of nature through individual pursuits of objective science, the arts were beginning to value the feelings associated with the subjectivities of romantic art. In some ways, there simply seemed to be an antithesis between materialist Romantic era science and spiritualist Romantic era art. More to the point, the misconception that the sciences and arts are antithetical can be traced back to misleading interpretations of renowned events and works of art from the Romantic period. In 1817, there is one dinner affair in particular that is usually considered the epitomic representation of anti-science sentiment. We are going to examine this event in order to exercise efforts in this class to understand the ways the sciences and arts have shaped each other over the course of history. In other words, through our examinations, we will come to see how the dinner is responsible in its own way for perpetuating this myth of anti-science, how the sciences and arts were influencing each other at the time, and how the event has been misconstrued in historical accounts. The event we're examining is called the Immortal Dinner. Already, this title evokes a romantic era of the occult, but in truth, the luncheon was rather a drunken affair, hosted in North London, December 1817, by painter and diarist Benjamin Haydon. Haydon had planned this occasion for the sole purpose of unveiling his proud project, the oil painting, Christ's Entry into Jerusalem. To dine with him, he had invited Romantic writers William Wordsworth, Charles Lamb, and John Keats. The painting was massive in size and hung just above the dinner table, depicting not only Christ, but Wordsworth, Sir Isaac Newton, Voltaire, and John Keats, mingling in the crowd to the right side of the painting. With Newton representing analytic science, Voltaire, godless French philosophical skepticism, Wordsworth, English piety, and Keats, childlike wonder, the painting instigated an argument at the table over the powers of reason against imagination. For by the time, although the 18th century had viewed the two as inseparable, arguments of the latter half of the Enlightenment had begun pitting reason and imagination as opposite functions of the mind. Reportedly, at the dinner, the group mocked reductive science, calling it destructive, complaining that the rationalization of nature demystifies its beauty and wonder. In a heated moment, Keats, the only one at the table with any real scientific training, congenially remarked that Newton had, quote, destroyed all the poetry of the rainbow by reducing it to a prism, end quote. Meanwhile, Haydon, an enthusiastic Christian who agreed that the new sciences were blasphemous, eagerly recorded it all to go down in history as the occasion on which the Romantic poets denounced the sciences. Of course, the event generalizes the view Romantic artists had of science at the time. On one hand, for instance, the event lacks voices from those coeval artists who would have been inclined to defend the sciences, such as Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Lord Byron, and Percy Shelley. On the other hand, this account of the dinner overlooks the fact that even those who were present at Haydon's dinner are represented with a slant. Keats' memorable witticism, for instance, is actually a far cry from condemning modern physics. The scientific work alluded to by Keats' comment is Newton's book titled Optics. This book gave many artists the knowledge to magnify, rather than destroy, the poetry of nature. In its pages, contrary to relegating the rainbow to a trick isolated by a glass prism, Newton observes how the rainbow is a stunning natural phenomenon that can be discovered using nature's own poignant tools. Raindrops and dew, for instance, could be used as delicate prisms to reveal the colors of the cosmos. Yet with the timeless truths they yield, they themselves are ephemeral, and easily overlooked unless one dedicates the eye to the level of the droplet. Keats knew and understood this, and in ironically ridiculing Newton, likely had a private chuckle with himself as he carried on with the joke. When looking at the origins of an anti-science myth in this period, William Wordsworth, most of all, is one from Haydon's luncheon whose perspectives and literature have suffered. Wordsworth is one of the most canonical figures of the Romantic era. When one studies Romanticism, invariably it is his principles of spontaneous, unpretentious, and vernacular art that come to the surface as defining features of early Romanticism. And it is in Wordsworth's corpus of literature that some of the first observable connections between Romantic art and Newtonian science are expounded. Yet, until recently, he has been frequently called upon as a champion of the anti-science platform. His poem, The Tables Turned, is somewhat to blame for this, for anti-science writers have found that it resonates with their cause. In the early 19th century, anti-science advocates appropriated a line from Wordsworth's poem as their rallying cry against the monstrosities of science. This offensive act was motivation enough for Sir Humphrey Davy, one of the most renowned scientists of the time, to renounce the poetry of his age altogether, and as a result, the poem has been used for the last 2 centuries as evidence of Wordsworth's hostility towards the sciences. To be fair, at its surface, the line does seem to denounce dissection, which at the time seemed to be a grotesque, blasphemous, and monomaniacal medicinal practice, as in the pursuit of anatomical and physiological knowledge, corpses were made the object of scientific experiment. Still, there is a growing number of critics who argue that the poem is misinterpreted. One opposing view is that the poem is not alluding to anatomical dissection, but rather the crime of dissecting disciplines, particularly those of science and art. This argument is based on the lines which immediately followed the supposed anti-science one. Altogether, they read, quote, "We murder to dissect, enough of science and of art." The idea is that in context, the two lines together are in actuality a clever criticism rather than an encouragement of the schism beginning to emerge between the reductive sciences and imaginative arts. Another way to read this is as a condemnation of Enlightenment thinking, which advocated the reductionist dissection of information in science, valuing parts over a whole, which means Wordsworth was actually promoting romantic holism in science and art, which values the whole over its parts. For instance, seeing nature as the great unification of all truths. And at the least, in retrospect, it can be said that Wordsworth's poem contains an ambivalent stance, one which either matures with time, or which his later work clarifies. William Blake is also one who has, until recently, been imagined as a foe of science when he only actually loathed the separation of science and imagination. In Jerusalem, Blake's narrator states, quote, "The primeval state of man was wisdom, art, and science," end quote. In other words, before the fall, science and art were unified in man. Thus, Blake's biggest grievance with Enlightenment science is that it divides itself from the arts, leaving itself mechanical rather than spiritual, dead rather than alive. It is for these reasons that on the cover of the Book of Urizen, Blake conceives of and illustrates Urizen, the god of limitation and reason, as a terrifying dark figure with tombs framing his back, like two angel wings now pulverized, cold, and unmoving. Then there are others like John Constable, who united the sciences and arts in other ways. Constable is known for his landscape paintings of his home region, the Dedham Vale of Suffolk, England, and is considered one of the best painters of the English skies. He felt that painting was a means of expressing feeling. At the same time, he strove to create scientifically accurate depictions of the Earth's atmosphere. In the painting shown here, Hadley Castle, Constable captures the moment he feels nature is overwhelming man. The image depicts a morning after a storm. The castle has long been in decay and ruin, the boats are all receding downstream towards the sea, and the foregrounded topography interrupts and challenges our view of the flat riverbeds that fall to the right and behind. The large dispersed cumulus, perhaps the remnant of a cumulonimbus, a towering cloud associated with thunderstorms and atmospheric instability, overshadows the scene. In this painting is feeling and observation united in nature, a romantic sense that nature is potentially cataclysmic, at the same time that Constable's realistic portrayal adheres to the Enlightenment thought that nature is ordered, cyclical, and predictable. More to the point, Romantic artists were not as comprehensively troubled by the sciences as is sometimes supposed. Many frequently adapted their creativity to carry sensation into science, as well as to deliver pleasure from scientific knowledge, reciprocating in each the gratifications of both disciplines in the other. Now, even though the myth of anti-science romanticism still lingers, Romantic art is becoming increasingly recognized as a bastion for interdisciplinary study as well, especially for ecocriticism. Ecocriticism is the study of nature through art with the goal of analyzing and revitalizing the relationship between humans and their environment. This approach directs us to ask how humans imagine, experience, and place themselves in relation to their environment as well as the non-human world. It does all this with the hope of effecting care for all things non-human. Because Romantic art is usually seen as particularly emphatic in its value of nature, ecocriticism is often traced back to this period. We should be careful of anachronisms, though. The idea of ecology, that is the study of ecosystems in which all living things are connected to all other things, was not introduced until 1866. Still, the idea that all things exist in a unified web of interdependency existed by the Romantic period. In the late 18th century, Joseph Priestley's experiments with chemistry were already making connections between animals and plants, showing that while animals need oxygen and exhale carbon, plants need carbon and produce oxygen. Those of the Romantic period, then, used the word economy rather than ecology to describe their understanding of the world. This brings up one important and final point. The word economy suggests a mastery or management over nature rather than a study of it, and ecocriticism strives very hard to counter the lasting echoes of dualistic Cartesianism, which, since its conception in the 17th century, has inadvertently rationalized centuries of us versus them mindsets. When it comes to examinations of the human and non-human, then, Ecocriticism asks that we do not idealize, fantasize, or allegorize nature and non-human things, but see, appreciate, and respect them for the equals that they are. And if there is to be a hierarchy, ecocriticism argues that we should value nature over the human, for without nature, humans would not exist. One way to exercise ecocritical thought, then, is to challenge ourselves to rethink subject-object relations. Take this figure and frame, for example. When we typically consider a framed work of art, we focus on the subject of the art. In this case, a time-frugal businessman, well-equipped for the day with his briefcase, tie, and watch, but for some reason impatient or confused. We don't normally talk about the frame. We privilege the figure over the frame. However, we could examine this work of art by its frame. The frame limits the figure, for instance, cutting off his feet. It distinguishes the figure from that which lies beyond the frame, and because it isolates it, it labels the figure as the work of art. This means the frame is central to the figure's position and importance as art. This is analogous to how we should be re-examining the way we view subject-object relations, for it is in this re-examination of how all things can be subjects and objects that begins to help bring the sciences and arts together in interdisciplinary study and eco-criticism.